It seems like, how did we decide, they worked fine, so I don't think you have to get especially close to it like we used to do. But we'll keep them on. Didn't affect feedback at all, but they had a conference or something in here the other day. Yay, oh, there we are.
Yeah, everyone's there. Maybe that's why it's just streaming the YouTube comment.
Delay, was like that delay.
Well, yeah,
So they're not gonna be able to see anything later on. But everyone can hear us.
That's fine,
Okay.
we're used to that. Okay, Mayor Allison and Holly, you can hear us, right?
Roger.
Okay. We're gonna get
Yes.
started. Okay, you're good, Kathy.
Yeah, I'd like to call the city council work session of October 4th, 2023 to order. Roll call, please.
Mayor Allison,
Here.
Tom Baylor is absent, Kathy Sherman,
Here.
Casey Kinsman,
here.
Wendy Rainey,
Here.
Ann Schaefer is absent, Kristen Carpenter here, and Ken Jones.
Here.
That's forum of council.
Okay, and I guess we're gonna kick off with you, Holly.
Okay, so I know we gave you a lot of materials to look at, and both in the property tax and in the sales tax realm. I'm going to start with the property tax exemptions and mainly the economic development exemption and a discussion of blighted property. Because I think this was, there seemed to be a lot of interest in discussing options using the economic development exemption during our last session. So one of the things that, and you have a memo from us on this, and we really focused on the changes to the economic development exemption. I'm going to be really fast when I talk about this. In general, this economic development exemption acts like a property tax wildcard exemption because it's so broad and it's very flexible. So it is an exemption that the city can use for a lot of different types of programs and policies. For example, if you wanted to incentivize housing, you can use the new economic development exemption to come up with a method to do that. So long as your criteria is clear and specific and laid out in the code, you will be in compliance with the provisions, give or take. So, I mean, it's very easy for us to fashion those criteria. For that reason, our goal was to change the economic development exemption language in the proposed title to ensure that you can actually use it for the development of existing improvements in buildings and property in a way that incentivizes economic development for the use of and really we were focused on housing and making sure it fit that criteria, and also the sort of the blighted building exemption, for lack of a better term, that's discussed in your memo. We can really use economic development and that exemption to use criteria to make sure your properties are safe and maintained, and those improvements meet the needs of the city. So that was our initial intent, was to bring that economic exemption, development exemption into a place where it's useful and it doesn't have the rigidity of the old economic development exemption. So I want to pause and actually ask council if this sounds like a good starting place for purposes of that exemption. Or if there's anything you think that we need to consider on the front end.
I think it's a good place to start. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think this is the area that we have the most interest in, and the others are kind of cut and dry. Not cut and dry, but.
Well, it sounds like this was the area that was completely,
Mhm.
whatever, rewritten or re-allowed us to have more, I guess, oversight, more broad oversight in developing that, so. That's probably good. To start.
Okay, great. So that really was the direction. I know we gave you a lot of information, but that was the direction that we needed. We did not want to broaden the scope of that exemption or really, change it in any way without getting council's input, seeing that it is policy based. So based on that, I'm going to move into sales tax exemptions. This was another area that we talked about. In a broader sense, we talked about some concepts that council threw out. For example, what about incentivizing local businesses and purchases from local businesses instead of, say, going outside to Anchorage and buying those same goods without having to pay tax, which put local businesses at a disadvantage. And as much as I would love to report that we have a magic bullet to address this issue, the truth is the bullet to address this issue is called use tax. And use tax is when you tax the use of a good or service as opposed to the purchase of it. And when you do that, you can capture those costs because whether or not they're purchased outside of Cordova, if they're used within it, we tax it, right? The problem is enforcement. And so I've spent some time trying to find an example of a effective enforcement procedure in any jurisdiction in the United States, and I have yet to find one. That does not mean it doesn't exist. There is always, we have use taxes. Somebody is probably doing that effectively, but enforcement really is the problem because you're relying on self-reporting in a much more isolated way, other than auditing those self-reports. How do you make sure that individuals are properly filing tax returns regarding their use? And so that is a problem. Now, sometimes though, I do think when you're looking at businesses in particular, there are mechanisms that I see some communities using to encourage or incentivize those reports, which leads to some enforcement, but there is very little. So that is the problem with use tax. Cordova has the ability to implement a use tax, but again, much like other communities, it's sitting on your books and doesn't actually lead to or generate revenue or lead to taxation. So that is the answer to that question. The other, when we look at that component, I think what the code has tried to do in order to equalize the playing field is provide an exemption, right, for construction materials capped at a certain amount. So when you see what I call the goods and services exemptions, when you look at the goods and services exemptions in your memo, but regarding the construction cap, and even perhaps even the shipping exemption, but when you go through them, you can kind of see how some of those are in that vein, right? You're trying to protect or provide a benefit, a tax relief benefit to local businesses. But one of the things that we see here too is there's some exemptions that really play against that goal. So that is one of the things that we're going to consider is how to narrowly streamline your exemptions to make sure that we certainly are not hurting a local business in a way that a outside goods or service provider is not impacted. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to penalize brick and mortar. At this point, one of the provisions that we're looking at is the construction cap. So that the construction cap, if you have your memo in front of you, that's on page 4. And so that is an exemption that exempts materials and services exceeding $3,000. Where the purchaser has obtained a building permit from the city. So just to pause, this addresses another issue raised by a council member, which is how do we incentivize building permits and make sure that we are sort of moving towards that safe and healthy infrastructure goal, right? So I think your code has actually tried to do that. So this provision, this $3,000 tax cap, it appears, and I don't know for sure, but it appears that this is put there for the local businesses. One thing to note, though, that this exemption is, and really, there are very few required exemptions in the sales tax realm. So when you see these exemptions, these are choices. These are choices the city has made to carve out exemptions for individual or certain transactions, and this is one of them. So I'll pause there and see if council has any comments regarding the construction cap and regarding these sort of local incentivization policy concerns that you want to express, so we can make sure we have your thoughts on this.
First thought is $3,000 does not go very far. Providing it, yeah. I mean, it's great, and when you're building any project, any kind of break is fantastic, but I mean, no one is, I guess, exempt from looking at how inflation is affecting everyone right now, and $3,000 is that I guess on the extent. I don't know what other communities are doing, if there's any interest in that looking differently, I don't know, but.
Evan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something for the conversation, probably for all of you, things I've heard from the community. One thing related to the construction cap is the way the code's written currently is, well, I guess like all codes, it's open to interpretation. But this one, it definitely provides clarity that construction materials are limited to items that are permanent features of the structure. The one thing that it's not clear on, and that has been has been brought up by people trying to develop in the community, is whether this should cover land development costs as well. Because obviously, as we know, it takes a lot of money to actually get the building site ready in this town. And so it could be potentially good to provide that tax incentive to the land development side. One thing that I would one thing that pops in my head to be maybe wary of is people taking advantage of that tax to get a property development ready, and then again, holding it for speculation purposes or flipping the property to somebody else to potentially build on. So I would just, be a little wary of how broad you go with it. Obviously, that's just my first thought on that. Talking about the amount of it, the $3,000. Juno, I believe it was Juno, specifically for accessory dwelling development. They're offering, I believe it's like $12,000 as like I don't know if it's like giving people cash, but pretty much like they'll give you $12,000 towards the construction of a accessory dwelling unit. So just even in terms of what this $3,000 compares to other communities. So.
And so just going back up.
No, go ahead.
On your comment there, would you say if we were gonna do or encompass land development, would you want, would you want to make sure that's tied to a building permit? And part of that process, if we're gonna allow a tax exemption, and that would be part of it, it would be have a building permit, show that you're actually building on this land. And if you do that, then your land site development can be part of that. Would that be how you would look at that, or want to see maybe something changed in that direction? Or would you want a separate land development as its own tax exemption?
I've looked at it as it could either be a lot of times people aren't sure what their house design is gonna be
Sure.
yet, until they can develop the property and actually figure out how are things actually gonna be able to, okay, I thought I could level over here, but I actually need to level over here. So, I mean, one route you could do is you have like a clearing and grading permit, like a permit that's just related to land work,
Mhm.
and then have a separate permit that's for the creation of the building and structure. So that's one way you could require it as a building permit. I mean, that's basically just doing a building permit under a different name. But with building permits, we can't issue them until we have a site plan and an elevation drawing, because we have to confirm setbacks and elevations and things like that, so.
So you would, I mean, and this is, now we're going into kind of a different conversation, which is fine. You would say, maybe we need to look at adding an additional permit. And that would.
Yeah, that
for
could
the-
just be something handled administratively, just when you're looking at the construction cap code, one thing that's been requested from other people is to see if you wanted to create language that's more specific to both site development and construction materials, whereas the way it's written currently, it's pretty heavy that, the way we've interpreted it is that it's construction materials, yeah. So that was all.
So that, would that also, I guess, we're talking revenue, again, we're going down the weeds a little bit, with a separate permit, if we're saying, okay, site development permit, I mean, there should be a fee associated with that, we're issuing a permit, there's a cost associated with.
Yeah, our permit costs are pretty minimal, like a building permit for a residence is $125. So, yeah, I mean, I guess you'd technically be doubling the permit costs if you had two separate permits, 125 each. And again, I mean, we only do maybe 20 permits a year, so as a revenue generator, I mean, it's a couple $1,000.
One thing I would recommend too, so when I listen to you talk, I hear a lot of discussion regarding development, right? That's sort of our emphasis. And previously, when this sales tax exemption was adopted, it was adopted in a realm where the economic development exemption didn't really allow very many property owners to use it. It was a very restrictive, it is a very restrictive exemption. So one of the things that might be advisable is to consider eliminating the sales tax exemption and building these exemptions into an economic development property tax exemption, so that you are maximizing the application of that exemption, because the materials cap really doesn't easily apply to the use or development of the property. We're really just talking about sales and services. So we can extend it to ensure that it goes from materials to services, so that would be one way to use it. But we want to be careful, or council at least wants to consider sort of at least considering, how about that? When you look at the charter for the city of Cordova and you look at the state statutes and the laws that apply to taxation, the intent was never to allow municipalities the ability to broadly use exemptions, right? Because then what happens as a matter of policy and or fiscal policy is the tax burden falls on a smaller portion of the population, and it is often the lower income portion and sort of your single taxpayer. And so your charter tells you must, that the exemptions are narrowly construed, they must be adopted by law, you cannot exempt anyone from taxation other than the ways that you lay out by law. And so there's this emphasis on that policy to make sure that you're taxing uniformly. And you see that under state statute too, which is why under property taxes, you have your optional exemptions and your required exemptions, and the city cannot exempt anybody else or any other property from taxation. So it's a very restrictive universe. They want the taxes. If you're going to apply a tax, then they want you to apply it. And then they very specifically identify who it does not apply to. So it's just something to keep in mind. That said, sales tax is where we have more freedom and more flexibility. But if we're talking about development, we should talk about property tax. And if we're talking about goods and services and sort of performance of those services within the city, that is where sales tax really comes into play. But we can do that. As you talk, I can separate out one from the other and sort of how they interplay, but we don't want to forget that. So with economic development, with construction, do we want to maintain a construction material exemption while also broadening an economic development property tax exemption? Because or do you want to draft an ordinance that does that and broadens the sales tax exemption as well as the property tax exemption, and then get a projected understanding of the cost of that to the city and the impact on its budget? And I mean,
Holly, this is Helen, could you explain a little bit more about what state does and does not allow a city to do around exemptions in the property tax realm? And maybe give some parameters on what that looks like.
sure. I mean, so the state's property tax exemptions, what we're allowed to do, right? We're allowed to have an economic development exemption, and now that's a pretty broad exemption. So that's why it's such a focus of our discussions. We are allowed to exempt certain, like up to $150,000 of a senior citizen's primary residence, right? We're allowed to adopt exemptions for disabled veterans.
Are we required?
Well, there's a portion that you are required to do, and then there's a portion that you're allowed to do. So we're required to have a property tax exemption for charitable organizations, nonprofit organizations, which includes religious, educational, and nonprofit 501c3, C4 generally. But we are not required to provide an exemption for their tenants, but we may provide an exemption for their tenants if they meet certain criteria, mainly that the revenue generated or the income generated from those leases does not exceed the cost of renting. The cost to the renter, I believe, is the exact language. So in the property tax realm, we don't have a lot of options. There's something I call the beautification exemption, and that allows us to provide tax exemptions for the beautification, for lack of a better word, of a property, for improvements that impact its and improve its aesthetic. So that is one thing we can do. And all of these exemptions, some of them have limitations as to the time and how many years that they apply, and to what dollar amount and assessed value that they can apply to. So I mean, I can run through them with you just to give you an idea. If that would be, does council want to sort of walk through them? That might be helpful.
Well, Holly, I was gonna say, I thought we went through a lot of this and it's in the last memo from last time, but there was another question from another council member that I'd like to get to. Kristen.
Yeah, thanks. Excuse me. I just wanted to ask when Holly was talking about maybe one approach would be not having the construction cap and putting that benefit or making that benefit available through on the economic development side. I just wondered about how would that simplify administering this for city staff? Because I think a big part of what we're trying to do also is make managing this more feasible, because I get the impression that there's people probably come in and they question, why can't I do this, or so-and-so got to do such and such, anyway, I just wonder what would that make it easier?
I think one of the things that was very clear when we did our community meetings last summer and fall was, especially around this, is the onus on the business owner who's selling the goods and services, that they have to keep track of every single solitary thing and the it gets complicated, not only for city, but for the vendor or the purchaser to keep track of everything. And especially with a home, you may not buy a whole package. You might be buying, oh, I need another 2x4 for this and another, I need another box of nails. Oh, the roofing material is, the sheet short, full X. So there's those kinds of things that over time accumulate over the course of a year and were very complicated to follow and track. So we heard loud and clear from the user side that it was not easy. So to answer your question, I think we need to look back even further than how hard it is for the city to administer is how easy or hard is it for the user and the beneficiary to accommodate.
And just since we're on this, in terms of the $3,000 cap, I realize there's a general category and the construction category, and I'm wondering if you have any sense of how frequently those two things are used. Like, is the construction one used way more than the general? Is the general used way more than the construction?
That I don't know. Yeah, I don't handle the construction one, but I don't even handle it. I'm a part of that process.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not sure what the difference between the two usages are.
Mhm. And I was just wondering if people have examples of when somebody might buy $3,000 worth of goods that's, they might get it, they pay tax on the first 3,000 and then they're getting more when it's not construction material, what other kinds of things are.
Engine installation,
Engine.
usually around the commercial fishing
Yeah.
industry, doesn't take much to hit.
Right.
So,
And also in our industry, like when community groups come
Mhm.
and pay for a package trip, if we lost that cap, that would deter these small colleges that come because we cap off their entire trip as a package of services. And so it's capped at 3,000 for the sales tax. If we lose that cap, that deters them from being able to afford that package trip. So we use the general sales cap.
Yeah, no, I wasn't proposing to get rid of it, I just
But no,
wanted
I
to
mean,
know what kinds of ways does it.
That's
get
our
used?
service. The engine was, I think, like something like an engine was in the commercial fishing, industry, the other big use
Well,
of
fuel,
fuel.
that's a big one.
Yeah,
I go
fuel
fill
is-
up my boat,
fuel
it's
is
like,
huge.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's
Did you
my
have
expense.
more to say?
Yeah, well, Wendy kind of hit the points, with my adventure tourism business, I sell packages to these groups of hunters and it would price me out of the market. I'm competing with boats from Whittier and Valdez that, maybe they don't have the same tax structures, and
Mhm.
also Kodiak and Sitka. There's companies like mine all over the state that do the exact same thing. And so I'm competing with them, and having that general cap go away would pretty much kill any of those groups coming here.
Okay.
So,
I just had a quick comment too. This was useful because I hadn't thought about the tourist and hunting industry. I only remember when this was put in place and it was for fuel and boat engines mostly. I would be in favor of eliminating this construction cap and moving it into the incentivized economic development part, though. That it is difficult to keep track of everything when you're building, too. So anyway, any other comments on those? Oh, sorry, Ken?
I would hate to see us get rid of the construction cap. I do think that the existing code does a fairly good job of incentivizing certain development. I guess, when I started pushing for this, I wanted to see us do more to incentivize. And I do think that the existing, go and get your building permit, you pay your 180, you go and you get a little card, and then if you go to Ace Hardware, you can get, no sales tax on that if you're buying screws or whatever. You go to the lumber store, buy a piece of plywood, you show them your card. I think that is a very user-friendly method of doing it, and I don't feel like it puts the onus on the city. They, are prepaying that tax essentially when they get their building permit, and then they just have the card that they carry in their wallet. No matter where they go in town, they can get it tax exempt if it's a building material for that project, so.
And to add to that, I think what we got as feedback is that the vendor has to keep track as well. And that's the difficulty, you know, that they have to keep track of every item. Oh, this is tax exempt. This is tax exempt. Yeah, it's not just one. Yeah, it's how many people came in with a tax exempt card. They have to demonstrate that, okay, you know, these 23 items in these 56 transactions are tax exempt, and they have to report that. And that seems to be a point of discouragement and frustration on the part of the vendors. Yeah. You see.
So to speak to that, I mean, just, I guess I would like to maybe understand how does this get tied into economic development plan? Is it like a $3,000 property tax exemption or credit, or, and then it's just on that end of it, you're still gaining something, but there's less of tracking paperwork or vendor use or someone, I mean, the benefit is there, it's just maybe easier to manage.
Not to discourage by this comment, but one thing that you want to keep in mind if you are considering doing a switch from the construction cap to something related to property taxes, you know, someone's gonna get a much more, you have to think about what are you gonna set that to, because right now, if I build a $100,000 house or a $300,000 house, that's a very different amount of taxes that that person isn't paying. And so the person that's spending $100,000, if the cap is equivalent to if you spent $100,000, then the tax, whatever, I guess that would be $6,000. With a 6% tax rate. So if you do $6,000 break on something, but then that person that was gonna build a $300,000 house, now they're discouraged from building that more expensive house that can be taxed higher later in the future because they're only gonna get a tax break for $100,000. You know, so that's one thing that's nice about the construction cap is it's flexible depending on how much you're spending on your structure.
Yeah, the more you spend, the more you benefit, but the city's gonna win on the back end because we're gonna get a more expensive building
Yeah, I was
tax.
gonna say, I thought that some of the exemption came in. Not necessarily the 6% sales tax, but what you could offer in the way of a deferment or. Abatement of a property tax for a certain amount of time, so then it would still be proportional.
Well, that's what I'm saying, you'd have to come up with a system
Right.
that benefits both the person that wants to build
Benefits
something
the
cheaper
at the same
and more
time.
expensive, so that the person isn't discouraged from building a more expensive house because, oh, well, I'm only gonna get this much of an exemption, whereas now their exemption is basically unlimited as much as they want to spend on a project.
I wonder if there's a way to do, I'm just thinking about some kind of separation or distinction between, because the. Property tax exemption, we were talking earlier about, do we want to extend it to site improvements so that people can start. Benefiting earlier in the project. And if there's some way to distinguish between. New development or redevelopment where you're. Starting from scratch or you're building a new structure as opposed to. Putting on a new wing on an existing house or adding a bathroom or something like that, where, yes, you might certainly spend more than $3,000, but you're not. It's not as large a scale project as. Creating a whole new structure.
I just wanna kind of point everyone back, the $3,000 construction materials cap. Was put in play, as I understand it, maybe someone can clarify, to help support our local building in construction materials businesses.
Yeah.
And that is the focus of this tax exemption. It's not about helping someone build a $300,000 house or $100,000 house. It's about how do we drive those individuals who are building a home to consider purchasing those goods and services here in Cordova rather than Anchorage, wherever else. I don't know to what extent we've been successful and that has made a difference or not, but this cap is very specific to the local vendors.
So I would be in favor of adding another cap, like what, Kevin has suggested for the, like, lot development, having another building permit with its own cap. I would be in favor of that. I think that would be used. I personally would have used it when I'm getting ready to develop this property next to my house. You know, I bought Phil from Wilson's, having Sheridan do the excavation, you know, it's like, I'm gonna have a couple hundred, you know, $600 in sales tax between the 4 vendors that I'm using for all the different work. And if I could have had that building permit, it would have been cheaper and would have incentivized me to follow the process of getting the, I mean, it's not a building permit, it's a lot clearing permit or whatever you want to call it. So I would be in favor of that.
So I just want to check in with you guys and make sure I understand, because you're talking about the services and goods for development. But I'm not, so could you explain, just, I want to make sure I understand how we're broadening, if we broaden this tax exemption, what we will apply to. Right now, it's the sales of construction materials and services for use in each construction project. You want to expand it just to all, to sales and services for construction and improvement or construction improvement or development of property. I'm just trying to make sure I understand how we'll word that, and also how we demonstrate that, you know, sort of the, if, when, so I'm not sure of the difference. So whereas, can you say it one more time, Councilmember Jones?
Well, so like right now, what city planner Kevin Johnson was saying is, you know, right now to get a building permit, you have to have elevation drawings, you have to have a site plan. You can't do that until your dirt work's done. So like for my particular project that I have experience with, I'm in the dirt work phase now. I went and got a conditional use permit, got that approved. Now I'm in the dirt work phase. The next step is to go get a building permit, but I'm going to, you know, I've got multiple different local vendors doing work for me right now. I'm gonna pay 4 or 5 of these caps and sales tax before I can even get to the building permit phase. So there would be another permit, which would be like a site prep permit that would make it where you can take advantage of this cap earlier in the process. And I mean, really, I would have to defer to him, but I think that's my take on it, and I would be supportive of that.
Yeah, I was just pointing out how the city has interpreted and enforced that construction cap is we've not allowed any tax exemptions for, like you said, site prep, you know, excavation, blasting, fill material. The way we've read and enforced the code is that it is purely for, you know, construction supplies for the structure, you know, 2x4s, cement for the foundation, that sort of stuff, as opposed to any of the site prep work. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that you may want to do, so you guys have sort of this dueling system of exemption and refund, right? You sort of have a refund and rebate piece. And interestingly, for the construction material where you have the limitation for the first 3,000, it doesn't apply. It doesn't line up for the refund. Perhaps what may work is instead of having an exemption, you move the exemption to a credit, or basically a refund, so that you are still requiring the building permit, but everything leading up to that permit is eligible for that refund amount. Would that accomplish the goal, so that you are filing for a refund of any sales tax paid for the entire, you know, for the entire project, including site prep?
I mean, I think if we went down that road, it certainly could work, but that seems like it might put more onus on staff.
Sounds like
So
it'd be easier for the vendors though.
it might be easier for the vendors.
Easier for them.
I would say that we definitely want to put some sort of like a clause, a sunset clause, or, you know, like a, you know, maybe like 12 months preceding building permit application or something like that. Like if somebody, spent all this money 7 years ago to do their dirt work and then they
Yeah.
sit on the lot forever.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to give them a refund. But, yeah.
Yeah, I had actually, thought about something like that, because like I said, you know, one thing you risk is someone dumps a ton of money into a property. The city doesn't benefit from those sales tax because we're going to expect that something's gonna get built, so then in the future we'll benefit on the property, increased property tax. But then if nothing gets built, then we lost out on the sales tax, and then there's no increase in property tax. And so kind of like, so what Councilmember Jones was saying is, if we did have some sort of system where you can, you know, the city would have to track it, that we refunded you this much, and then you have X number of years to actually construct something on that site, or you then owe the tax back plus interest or something like that, you know, I mean, I just think there needs to be some way that we're just not losing out on the sales tax, then also potentially losing out on the property tax while somebody benefits from developing that property tax-free and then flipping it for a profit, and then whether that's actually gonna get constructed on if they flip it or not. So, I don't know if that's as big of a concern as I'm thinking it could be, but
I was
I
gonna
just
say, I don't know,
wonder.
how much would we actually lose?
Yeah, I think there's, two things. We don't know the economic implications of any of this. It's kind of hard to measure.
Yeah.
We don't know who would participate or not. I think the assumption is that it's an incentive. And the question is do we collect the tax up front and refund it? Or do we? Or do we just waive the tax, and then if someone doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, then we then will collect. And I'm not sure what's easier. And Holly, I don't know if in your investigations, you had any best practice models out there that you thought maybe we should take a look at?
Well, this is a very unusual exemption that Cordova has, so it's, just so you know, it's not something we commonly see in Alaska. Most communities are applying tax to these types of transactions. So there's not a lot to look at, but I will say Cordova currently has an exemption and a refund. And so using both methods is probably one of the most burdensome administrative approaches, you know, that we could take on. And it creates confusion because people are not sure which one to use, or maybe they're not aware of both, or maybe they use both, you know, and so what I would recommend is we simplify, you know, that the city erase the ambiguity surrounding transactions, whether it's a single or multiple transaction, and eliminate the ability to game that system, and place the burden of that game on the vendors and on the business owners, because that does happen. You know, that's who is asked to produce a certain amount of invoices or to do it one way or the other. And that just creates confusion. Even if council really wants to incentivize these and adopt a healthy exemption, you know, and that is broad, I think we want to do that just very deliberately and directly. And I think that you should eliminate the refund or use it. I mean, that is, you know, and that said, that legally speaking, you are welcome to have both and to use both, but it creates confusion for implementation and then for defense. So what we can do when we draft it is we can create an exemption, and we will create an exemption that reflects the broader scope of what council is looking to exempt and incentivize, and try to do that in a way that doesn't raise questions or alternative ways of submitting invoices to get at the tax. So it's just direct. And then we will look at the cost of those changes to the extent we can, you know. And then the other piece is, I think we should eliminate refunds, or go with the refunds. Basically, and eliminate the exemption right on the front end. So one or the other. And I think what's happened is there was a desire to incentivize conduct, and instead of repealing an exemption and adopting a credit, everything just sort of got thrown in. I think that's what it looks like.
Is Is there, if somebody applies for a building permit, there's no requirement that they actually build something, is there?
No.
Yeah, as I was gonna say, we could require, like, if somebody wanted to, we could say you can apply for a refund if you get a building permit within a year of doing the work, but they could pay $150 and not do anything with it. But I wonder if you could say something like, we'll give you a full refund if you, because somewhere in this example, there was language about the day of construction was the trigger for some qualifying.
Is it 18 months?
I just meant, no, I meant the actual breaking or initiating of construction was the trigger for something. So I thought, could you use that as a, if somebody wants the $3,000 construction, let's say we offer them a refund, because in my mind, if they have to hold on to their receipts and document that they spent this money and then they get a refund, that's easier than asking all the vendors to keep track of everything. But they don't, they could apply for a refund and get a building permit and not actually do anything with it. But could you say, get a building permit within a year? And if you actually start construction, then you get a full refund. And if you don't start construction, then you get half of your refund, so that we're not giving it all back.
And that is, oh, I apologize. That is what your code attempts to do with the refund. I think the language you're remembering is the 4-year limitation. So you get a refund for the materials so long as the project does not exceed 4 years. And I think that is trying to get at that concept. And it's interesting because I think the way you just said it does it much better. The limitations you talked about are and tying it to the completion or the substantial completion of a project, for example, is much more effective than tying it to the start of a project. Or I think the language is really that the project does not exceed 4 years. So cleaning up that language and creating a refund program in which individuals who are constructing are saving those receipts and know that and they're getting the proper permits and know that they're going to have to submit that to the city with the documentation at the end of the project, or at the completion of construction. And that's what triggers the refund. That is closer for construction materials exemption. That's closer to the objective. All right, what I believe would be the objective.
There's one other thing I want to throw on the table to point out, because I know it came up at least once, where someone purchased construction materials in a community that did have a sales tax and tried to get a refund from us because it isn't specific to Cordova city sales tax. So I think that's just a clarifying thing too, as well, is that we are really looking to provide that sales tax refund for tax that would be attached, because the transactions in Cordova, not in Seattle or wherever. So
Except with the remote seller now, even the Amazon purchases and even the other online purchases are being taxed.
right, but if someone is buying a construction package out of Seattle, and it is being shipped to Cordova, I don't know where that transaction accrues to the tax, but it was a construction package that was being shipped from Seattle, and the sales tax was accrued out of our community. And because there maybe wasn't clarity enough in our code, they felt that they were owed that refund.
Well, and to build on that, so the situation that the city will often find itself is that because you have a refund and you have an exemption, there likely are many that are getting the exemption on the front end, and then then you go for the refund and you get a refund on taxes that were never paid because they were exempted. Because the language of the refund and the language of the tax exemption they were not designed to work together. Different councils at different times developed these these tools, these instruments. So it creates for administration, it's difficult, but also if we are exempting taxes that weren't paid, no, that is a legal problem, right? That's unlawful conduct. We're not allowed to do that under the Constitution. So so that's just another reason to just clean this up. And I think it's easier to clean up when we understand sort of where your policy interests are. So that's very helpful. And I think that we can use that to come forward. I guess the one thing I would ask is if we were able to capture the benefits and identify where we didn't, if we cannot, would council be interested in seeing just a refund and no sales tax exemption, or to capture those, the project completion and avoid redundancy? Or does that make council nervous and you want to, avoid removing that exemption? I guess that would be a question for council that I would love to get your thoughts on.
You want to go around the room real quick?
That would be.
We'll start with you.
Yeah, I think tying it to completion is, I think probably the most appropriate way to, I guess, resolve the refund and track the refund. I guess I have a question for, administrative on the city side. Is there a benefit? So we're talking a 4-year construction project. I mean, if that's the gap or whatever, but right now it's 4 years. The refund is tied to the end of completion. Let's say it's in the 4th year, that's when it is actually completed. For tracking how much refund is owed, is there a benefit to on a annual basis, something being submitted so we could be tracking that at the end of this project, we know what will be owing this individual? I mean, I'm just curious. And in my mind, if I'm trying to budget something, I want to know what at the end of this, instead of in 4 years from 3 years prior, I'm now paying out X amount of dollars that I haven't in a sense budgeted for. Because now, no, we're not seeing anything from the vendors anymore. They're not submitting anything. We're putting it all on the user, which I think is fine and fair. But from a city standpoint, is there a risk associated with that?
Yeah, so first of all, bless the finance department, because they already are one of the hardest working departments in the city. So anytime you're gonna shift things back this way, it's definitely gonna create additional work for the finance department and anybody else in the process. Personally, I think that probably is the more appropriate route to go, though, even with the increase of administrative time that it's gonna create. I think it should only have to be done annually. Or it should be required to be done annually, at the end of the year. The person submits, whether it's a form we come up with or an Excel sheet or, and then they total it out. And then we just track that once per year. So then at the end, we can then pull out each of those 4, this is what you paid over the last 4 years or however many years, and then deal with the refund that way. I don't think it'd be good to have somebody come in with their shoebox full of receipts 4 years later, and dumping it on the staff. So yeah, I definitely think we would need to come up with a very clear form so that it's minimal additional work on the finance department. And also, I think it would also help. I mean, this is a personal opinion, I have nothing to back this up, but any of that potential misuse of the tax cards out in the community, if someone actually has to turn in their purchase log to the city, I feel like that has a little more gravity than you're just out of the store using your card whenever. So.
And we do get shoe boxes with. these things.
But we also have once a year, it's by February 1st.
Yeah, but it is still shoe boxes of receipts. And I think sometimes people do just have some fun with us. So Holly, you were saying that other communities don't offer this exemption. Are you aware of any in Alaska?
I didn't find any that have, I found caps, there are some caps. I didn't find the $3,000 cap is pretty low, except for, so the amount of most individuals are allowing that, or sorry, individual communities are allowing the exemption at a, above 10,000, for purchases in the sort of $10,000-12,000 range instead of the 3,000. And when you look at the codes, you really see a difference between the codes that haven't been changed in 20 years and those that have been changed in the last 10. That's really all that is if they haven't looked at their code in 20 years, then they have $3,000 because that was the number, right? That was the number back in the 70s and early 80s. And if they have, I see those numbers moving up in the $10,000 to $12,000 range. And I don't know what that looks like financially for the city, but it is worth noting if you have a $3,000 cap and the code doesn't change, then you're really increasing the exemption, right, every year because of inflation. So what I have seen that was interesting is I've seen some communities maintain a lower cap. And I believe that is in part to make sure they're not sort of shocking the public or changing something in a way that has a negative impact and burden, but they're building in an increase and an inflation increase on their caps, which I thought that was really smart. One, it's something that businesses and individuals can anticipate and plan for. And two, it's going to reflect the economy when tied, especially to a consumer price index, without turning the discussion at that low level into policy, so it's really looking for something that remains uniform, equal, and not an increase or decrease. It's based on just the change in the economic market. So that was a long-winded answer, I realize, but this type of exemption is not that common. I didn't see it anywhere. I did see general caps, but most of them are higher.
Just to add to that, we are also talking about, it's $180 exemption when you take the 6% of the 3,000. So really, I don't know what the power of that incentive truly has when we're just talking about $180. I get that, everybody's situation is different, but if we're talking about creating real incentives, we're talking about $180 currently.
No, and everything above that.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying
They're
yeah,
paying 180.
Yeah, so they're getting.
yeah. Sorry, I
Everything
guess.
past that. Yeah. And that is a good point though, that it flips because that is an excellent point, Kevin. It is what it's exceeding $3,000, right, for that exemption.
Right.
But it's confusing. The language is very confusing, even to lawyers. When they first read it, it's very easy to flip, and not all the exemptions are worded with the same, some are capped the other way. So cleaning that up is absolutely we definitely have to do that. And that we will do.
Does that answer your questions?
I think, yeah, that answers my question. I think I would be in favor of the refund side of things. I'm open to someone convince me otherwise, but right now that makes sense to me, but.
Yeah, so the $3,000 cap, we raised that a couple of years ago, so I can't remember what it was before, 2000.
I was gonna say
15, I think.
It went from 2,500 to 3,000.
And it was
Didn't make
raised,
enough money to pay for the code change.
yeah,
It was ridiculous.
so.
We tried to go to 7,500 and the people referred it at an election.
Mhm. So I would not be in favor of raising that at this time. I'm not really in favor of removing it. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm not a vendor, but I prefer the method that it is right now, where you get an exemption card. I guess I could see where it might be onerous for the vendors, but I would prefer to see it get rid of the refund side of things, because that seems like we're burdening our staff and using staff time and not getting a return for that investment. Yeah, I don't want to see us get rid of the construction cap, because I think that is completely opposite direction of where I want to go with incentivizing development. I want to incentivize as much as we can, and I think this does a good job of incentivizing development and local purchase. But I just want to take it a step further to incentivize even more. I mean, Cordova already has some of the easiest building codes and building permit process in this country, so, but, you know, I think that, you know, I would like to see us shift this conversation less on the sales tax side, more on the, how do we do property tax on that? Like we were talking about at the beginning, having, you know, property tax, economic development incentives.
Okay, we'll just finish comments then on this specific subject. So Kristen.
I think I do lean towards the idea of structuring it as a refund rather than putting the burden on the vendor to do the record keeping, because I mean, we're trying to help them. This is to benefit the vendors, right? So I feel like that's, and anyway, but I see the value of keeping the construction cap. I don't have any problem with that, but I would like to simplify how it's managed somehow, because the system right now is a lot of work on both sides, it seems like, and I don't think we're trying to get beyond that, so. Yeah, thank you.
Wendy.
I like the idea of the cap, but I think I'm leaning more towards the refund side than the individual vendor side. But I do like the idea of the cap for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
Okay, I guess. I like the idea of making it a refund. It is, your last sentence here, when you talk about a very clear policy goal of exempting, and then it says, but it doesn't say it clearly. So, I mean, that just, it's so what we're dealing with here, but I don't, I think 4 years is long. I guess I would shorten it to 2 years. I build a house in a year. I mean, I don't know if you're gonna clear your land but that's just I think 4 years is too long, so. Other than that, then maybe we can move on, Holly, and just focus on more of, I know people were way more interested in the incentives and taxing property that was blighted and would that work for everybody? We're an hour in. Is there anything else?
There are questions they had for us for the sales tax. We started out talking about property, dumpster sales tax. And
Yeah.
I guess I would like, since we're on sales tax, I would say, could we take 15 minutes and get through whatever questions we need to answer for Holly?
Sure, Holly, can you specifically give us questions you had regarding sales tax?
Sure. All right, I'm just gonna run through. So my questions generally involve things you're not required to do, but we find in your code, and I want to make sure that it's intentional. So we addressed the first one. The second one is the transportation exemption, which I've heard some about this tonight. So I know that for some, maintaining a exemption for recreational flight seeing, charter operations, is something they want to see, but I want council to know you don't have to. And that's one of the things right now, the exemption that the city has on gross receipts or proceeds from the transportation of what is in essence interstate or intrastate commerce is a somewhat confusing way to say that. And I think this exemption came about because the state adopted a statute that required certain commercial aircraft activity to be exempted. And that was required because the US code required it. But this does not extend to those sort of flight seeing charter adventure services. And so right now, certain tourism and industries are subject to tax. This is one that's not. So I want to find out if council wants to see the exemption narrowed or if you want to just maintain the exemption as it is. And the city of Bethel has adopted an exemption that really narrows the scope. And they're the only ones that I have found that have, taken the time to really look at the laws that underlie the exemption.
And the example I think we see most often is on heli skiing operations, the entirety of the helicopter cost for the package is not taxed. And that's a substantial portion of a package, but it is not, has not been considered to us.
And so does this not apply to, say, the charters, like sport fishermen coming in and getting chartered out to a lodge?
Right now, no one, I
I mean, that seems to not apply. But they must get an exemption.
but, and yet, you guys are only exempting up to $3,000, right? So there's confusion. Some are saying 100% of the transportation, air transportation is exempted from sales tax. And some are saying, we will exempt only. And I think, what would be really essential is we provide that clear direction.
Yeah, I mean, if it's gonna keep an exemption, it should be capped, like the other caps are. But, yeah, it's, right now it's not, and I think we're losing quite a bit because of that. But I have no trouble keeping a transportation exemption, but I definitely want to see a cap on it and state it on there. We just assume that we just cap it at 3,000 like we do our other things.
But some people say because of this transportation exemption that you don't have to tax any of it, and they don't. So we want it would benefit city to have more clarity on that.
Well, I would either like to see us expanded to include boats or done away with, because right now I pay my $180 per group because I'm taking them on a boat, so I don't qualify for this exemption. And the air taxis aren't charging sales tax, like the couple of services who are my direct competitors, they don't have to charge sales tax because they're doing it with an airplane. But I'm doing it with a boat, so I have to charge my guys sales tax.
And 180 is per person and it's a percentage of your charter fee?
I do it, yeah, per contract. So I just charge one person for the whole group. And that's how I've interpreted it, but yeah, maybe I'm doing that wrong, but.
Perfect example. That's it.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking.
It's all about interpretation. I mean, Points North doesn't pay anything, so.
Yeah, I do one contract.
Do those people pay bed tax? The heli ski folks, when they come out, are they paying?
I don't know, because we lease our property to them, so I don't see their individual invoices. I don't know what their package
The total
payment includes when it comes to the city.
from Points North is rather small.
Yeah, I think we have to talk about that.
Well, but I mean, I don't know how they handle the bed tax, because I don't do the books for them. Like, we are leasing the property, not dealing with the individual reservation.
So from what I'm hearing, what I'm going to do in this first draft of the ordinance, is I'm going to bring this back to the mandated sort of legal limits. And then we can expand from there, but by pulling it back, then you're bringing those sort of transportation providers in the adventure travel, ecotourism realm to equal treatment. It sounds like, so the boats and the flights are treated the same. So I'll do that, but I will make sure I flag it so that council is aware, wherever we have a change, I'll flag it, but also flag the discussion and considerations that underlie it. Does that sound?
Great.
Okay.
Did I hear you correctly? You said you are going to include boats? And
No, I think they're gonna take it back to the minimum
Okay,
required by
okay.
US code.
let's try.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that would just make it where it still qualifies under the general cap, but that's it.
That's,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. The next one is medical service exemptions. So medical service exemptions, I think that this exemption either stems sort of out of policy or out of a requirement that nonprofit hospital services are exempt. So that is a constitutional provision. We look at nonprofits, and within them, we have, we have schools, we have hospitals, we have church and religious activities, and we have sort of your general nonprofit. So anyway, when I look at this, I see some odd things across the state. I do see people have exempted just everybody but, say, massage therapists. I saw that in one location. And a lot of people have this exemption, but the reality is it's not required. I did call the state because I questioned myself, because we see it a lot. But it's not required, at least not to the extent that it is applied. So it is one thing I just wanted to raise with council, with the understanding that a nonprofit organization providing medical services would be exempt. It's when you have a for-profit provider of these services.
So for example,
No, go ahead.
the Prism Optical folks that come, they are not nonprofit, presumably, they're probably private practice, so they would not be exempt.
They would not be exempt, so sales tax would, they would apply a sales tax to those services, so it's.
And the hospital
Is a nonprofit.
prescription pharmacy that's in the hospital is considered nonprofit, so they're not
Part of the hospital, right?
Holly, are you hearing that? Is that all true?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting perspective, because we cannot tax the municipal, the political subdivision organization. A public corporation, quote unquote, a public corporation is protected from exemption. So the hospital is a public corporation of a municipality. So it's exempt, but not for the reasons that we would necessarily think.
Well, I guess that was my question on this too, is like Prism Optical, the audiologist who visits, the chiropractors, the vets who visit, they don't practice here regularly. So are we exempting them?
Do you mean currently, or do you mean under if we eliminate the exemption?
Well, currently,
None of them pay tax currently. Yeah, because veterinary's in here, chiropractor, dentist,
but
they're
they're
all.
coming from out of town, so they're not charging sales tax. They're not within our hospital. They're not
Right, but they're all exempted because of the exemption that exists right now.
within the state.
Within our code,
Cordova's code.
which we can get rid of, is what Holly said.
Okay.
Because they're providing the services in Cordova. When they do come there, they're providing the services in Cordova. And those are, it's only those services that we have the ability to tax. We tax the services provided.
And I think they all have
get a
business,
license.
they all
Yeah,
have
They
business
do
licenses.
get it.
And the vet actually did charge tax the first time she came in error, and then we returned it.
And that's interesting because I think veterinarians are not always on the list. It's the oddest list in a sense, because you have, some of them have a naturopath, some of them don't include it. Again, Bethel excludes massage therapists specifically. Others don't, others have, chiropractors, others do not, so there is this sort of interesting approach to the exemptions for medical services, because it spells them out and identifies them, which is another thing. I'm not sure that we need to do that. If you really want to exempt all medical service providers, we can simply refer to the licensed medical providers under certain state statutes and do it in a much cleaner way. So
Does Prism Optical pay sales tax?
Nobody pays sales tax.
But are they not listed? Is this up?
Well, it's optometrists.
They're all
Oh,
exempted.
well, then, yeah.
So-
I'm sure they just,
I guess the question is, do we exempt them or not?
I think we do. Oh, but I see what you're saying. You're asking if you guys want
Do we want to change
remove
it?
it.
So it's the intention behind this exemption, so that way we can incentivize these service providers being in our community, because I would hate to see us get rid of the exemption and then for some reason it becomes untenable for them to do business here, but, it would, for some of these, a lot of it's covered under insurance as far as dental and chiropractic. Would those insurance providers pay the tax, or would that be on the patient? There's some nuance here that I don't fully.
I guess, and that's where I was headed to. These are all services that we kind of need and we don't necessarily always have. But I was just trying to see if we're being fair across the board.
Well, all they would be doing was adding tax to the patient and or the insurance company. So it's not as though they would go away. I mean, I guess if they thought that was too much work to do, to collect and remit.
I mean, I don't really want to raise people's medical costs, and push more business out of town. But I also, if their copay is gonna be $75 no matter what. And the insurance company's picking up the rest, like, who cares if we tack on an extra $10 in tax or whatever, it's like. It would just help the city, so. But there's a lot of nuance there, I guess I don't fully. know.
Now that we're not self-funded, that's okay.
Yeah.
When we were self-funded, that would have been bad. I guess we
I
wouldn't have
guess,
been able.
Holly, do you have an answer to that, at least to the insurance piece of that tax?
No, it's a great question. I don't have an answer, but I'll get one. But I don't know.
It doesn't specifically mention acupuncture.
No, it doesn't. But does that fall under natural tax? I don't know, the answer that is, I guess, when we ask, does.
Yeah, I think this is back to what Holly was suggesting, that we broadly define it by whatever the state standards are around what medical providers are called. Or are under categories or whatever.
Yeah.
Because it does seem like every time you turn around, there's a new type of medical provider. It's like, what the heck was a dosimetrist, right? Never heard of that word until the last 10 years. And every time. Yeah, so it's like, and then, and I think what gets included and not included, I think really.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we can make it more straightforward by at least conforming with the state standard, that would be a step.
Okay, so for the draft, I will, unless I hear otherwise from you guys, I am going to clean this up and make it clear and tie and remove sort of the laundry list. And then I will work with administration to identify that may broaden the scope of this particular exemption. So just so council knows sort of, where, I mean, obviously there are individuals that wouldn't be included in the list. So by broadening it, by cleaning it up and making it clear, it may expand its application. In truth, I'm not sure in reality that, any medical provider who's applied, I'm not sure that, and I'll defer to this administration on this, but do we have medical providers that we have told, no, you are not exempt because the nature of medicine that you're practicing falls outside the scope? Have we had that happen?
No.
Okay. So that, that suggests that by cleaning it up, we likely will not have a fiscal impact. So I'll do that and then present that to council, and then we can go from there if you decide that you want to revise it further.
Councilman Green.
I just have a quick question. The split sales tax. I'm new to council, so how has that conversation come up in the past with a May to October rate and a October to,
We've done that.
April rate? And was that unsuccessful? Or I just think taking advantage of the number of people that are in the community over those months seems to be a lost income source.
Other communities do that.
I think there's only 2 or 3 right now.
in the summer?
Make it more than 6% in the summer, maybe
But I
Make it a
think
little less
what
than
the state cap,
6% in the winter.
7.85 is what's by statute, something like that. So if we brought it to 7.85, but in the winter brought it to 3.85 as wash for someone who lives here. In theory, it's a
In theory.
wash.
Right,
Who lives here year round, you're paying the average out same amount, but we're capturing more. revenue.
we're capturing more revenue because of the income in the summer.
Is there a state max?
I actually thought it was 6%. I thought we were there, but.
And that may have increased.
Yeah.
Actually, there was a cap and it was definitely more than what we were paying already.
I know we looked at doing an 8 and 4. 4 years ago. and
Yeah, we've definitely
Ended
looked
up
at it.
going the different route because of community
They were only like
participation was against it.
3, I think.
But I think there used to be a vendor pushback on the administration of it, but look at the technology today, that can't be an issue anymore.
No, it was
Is it
only like
like-
3 years ago and the technology is the same, really.
Well, but.
Well, like Kodiak has a 7% sales tax, but like Skagway is 3% October to March and 5% April to September. Sitka is 5% October to March, 6%
But
April.
these communities are capitalizing on cruise ships.
Right.
They have a head tax associated with that. I mean, I had asked the same question, like, why are they so low? What am I missing? What is going on?
Right.
They also have a broader tax base.
Yeah.
Larger
That's
population.
Skagway.
Not Skagway, not.
It's all the
not-
cruise ships. Good.
Yeah. Seldovia is another one. Those are the only splits right now. And then Wrangell is what, 7% with a $3,000 cap per transaction. On sales tax.
One thing that some communities have done that I thought was creative is if they raise the tax during a particular season, they might provide a exemption for non-prepared foods during that season. I'm not suggesting you do that. I realize that that might be administratively burdensome, but it just shows you that if you go with a split tax, sometimes it's helpful to consider how that reflects on your exemptions, right? And during that time, so.
But our industry buys all of that, so that's actually something we would want to cash in.
Right.
Our industry is loading boats up with groceries.
Well, I mean, just based off the tax foundation, Alaska has a local sales tax rate cap of 7.5%.
Where is that?
Just pulled up tax foundation,
Oh.
or it just kind of goes through all
Yeah.
the states and.
Well, Holly, we're down to half an hour, so we'll keep plunging forward here.
Annette, okay, so you have a travel agent commission exemption.
Why?
I haven't seen this anywhere, I'm not sure, so I just wanted to make sure you still want that on the books, because it's a little bit unusual.
No,
No.
Okay,
I don't even, it hasn't even been used in forever. I'm telling you.
and I worry that the way it would be used is someone trying to sort of find their way under it, such as a Airbnb establishment or something like that, so that's the other reason, or Expedia. I don't have many questions on the school exemptions or the club dues or the nonprofits because or childcare. Unless someone from council raises those, I'm presuming that some of these basic policy exemptions are not ones that we need to revisit at this time. So I will just throw those out there and see if someone has a specific concern or comment they want to make about those exemptions.
We'll see
Okay.
how it happens.
Okay, so you have exemptions for resale and manufacturing, and those exemptions are designed to avoid double taxation. I would, so long as council is okay with this, like to clean them up, because their real purpose, it's not that they exempt resale. They exempt one layer of the products, the goods, being of the sale. And I think that we could put them together and make that clean. As long as nobody has a problem with that, it'll come back to you. It'll look like an exemption has disappeared, but they will be a incorporated exemption.
I did have a question with the interpretation of that, because like for food resale, when food is coming out of a drive-through window and the entire package includes the plate and the silverware, they're including that product as their end product in the sale. And so the non-food items are exempted for that vendor, but not for another vendor that's got a brick and mortar. The interpretation on what is included in that is just kind of loose, and I wondered if we could clean that up a little bit. Because
I
like
think that's an excellent idea to clean it. I mean,
but my business, when I go to get supplies at the store, the only thing that is exempted is food. Nothing involved in the preparation of that food, nothing involved in the sale of the final product. So paper plates, paper utensils, cleaning products, nothing else is involved in that exemption. It's only a food-based ingredient that's involved in that. But I've seen other businesses that interpret that differently with the end product and what comes out of it. So I just like to see that cleaned up a little bit.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You're going to have businesses interpret this differently, and some who are being conservative in their interpretation are going to be harmed by that, right? And so, because and the city will benefit because of their, their position, but we just want to make sure the language is clear and that everybody is, that it applies equally to everybody, regardless of their interpretation. So I couldn't agree more. And so I will, again, unless I see some objection by council, we'll just clean that up and make sure it's easy and to administer. Another exemption that the city has, and it is an exemption on the sale of real property and a portion of brokerage commissions on those sales. So this one took a little bit to figure out where the exemption came from and why, but I do think one of the problems is Alaska's doesn't have mandatory disclosure for the sale price of a home or the purchase price. And so that creates difficulties in administering any type of tax on the transfer of property. The real estate industry and brokers in general, they have been very, they have advocated very strongly to avoid having the requirement that the property assessed value be disclosed. That's had a couple, I think in part their fear has been a property tax, right? So that's why they haven't wanted it, because the if you disclose the value of the property, it makes that sale easier to tax. A lot of communities have sought that information because they want to understand what the value of property is for assessment purposes, for a bunch of other reasons, development reasons. Juneau tried to adopt a disclosure provision. I think they had it for a couple of years, and that's what I'm basing my understanding of the industry's response on. But it's something I just wanted to throw that out there so council is thinking about it. And I don't know if council wants to see a removal of that exemption, or if they want to see the adoption of a disclosure requirement so council can get an idea of what the value of that exemption is or the cost of that exemption is. I know it's a big question.
Well, it does seem odd that because we do charge sales tax on rent, right?
Yes.
Correct.
So we're taxing one, but not the other.
Holly, in places that do tax the sale of property, it has to be at the same sales tax rate of your general sales tax?
Places that tax it, I don't know of any places that tax it. And I think mainly because they don't know how to value it. Right?
Well,
Well,
hit the cap.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that would use the cap in the other way, right? So we often talk about taxing what exceeds a certain number. But I think you could do a cap on going the other direction. So that, and you could create a system where a person could protest by showing that that it didn't cost that amount. So if you're taxing the first $30,000 of a transaction or $50,000, most of your property is going to exceed that. The one thing that you hear policy wise is the fear that that tax will get passed on to renters. If you have a renter and they're also paying the sales tax on rent. So there's some tax mechanisms communities are coming up with to prevent that from happening, but it's something to consider. And usually the way they prevent that from happening is they come up with a credit for the renter of sales tax when, that sort of is equal to a certain portion of the sales tax for the property owner. So it's that might be a little further than we want to go right now, but I would, it's something for council to consider as we move forward, because that is a substantial amount of revenue. I would imagine.
Opportunity here in order to apply or have this exemption apply to you or an individual, you must disclose what your transaction was, what your property sold for. And then that kicks into, instead of this a blanket real estate or property sales tax exemption. Maybe you were saying that earlier too already.
No, I think that's a good idea. But I think we still are in the place where, I think this would be an interesting conversation to invite the industry to participate in, because I do think they will show up to oppose it. So maybe finding out sort of, is there a way to structure, an exemption or refund cap in a way that is more fair to the individuals paying tax on rents?
And can the caps that we have in place be different for different things?
Yes, you can change, you can exempt a certain amount as opposed to another amount. And you can go the other way. We have caps that, exempt amounts exceeding, and you can have caps that, exempt amount under, right? So you exempt an amount up to a certain amount and tax everything else.
Can you exempt types of structures? So like residential exempted, commercial not exempted, or some variation?
Yep. I think that we could build sales tax exemptions that attempt to encourage housing, or the providing housing.
Holly, we're starting to gain an audience for our meeting. Can we, and some of the audience I know is interested in the incentives, the last part of our package. Can we just jump onto there, or does anybody want to talk about the heating oil?
I kind of thought that's what we were gonna spend 2 hours talking about, was the property tax stuff, so. I'm a little frustrated that we spent so much time on the sales tax side of things, but.
We probably need another work session, but the sales tax thing is really probably the hottest topic button with the public. That they said we did a couple meetings. And this is something that everyone's been looking to resolve, so I think this has been real productive and I appreciate it.
And I do think with property,
Okay, no, that's right. Let's finish out, this part of the sales tax, the heating oil exemptions and exploring other sales tax, and then we can discuss as a group, I guess, if we're gonna try and have another work session.
when I think that I have the direction I need, that actually concluded sort of the hot topics I needed council's direction on the sales tax. And with regard to the economic development, property tax and housing incentives, which, and the blighted property exemption under property tax. I mean, I think one thing that so there's two ways to approach this. I think we heard council's goals regarding using the economic development exemption in a way that was meaningful in Cordova and actually led to development of parcels and properties. We can draft a economic development exemption that is fairly broad, but provides criteria that complies with the statutes. And we can take the exemptions for beautification and the restoration of blighted properties, and we can put those in the code and make sure that they capture sort of a full approach to development, restoration, and infrastructure. And so we don't need, I mean, if that's where council wants to go, we can do that in the sales tax or in the Title V ordinance. And then we can work through what is protected, what is not, what is incentivized, and what is not. So that might be a way to build a work session, in essence, into the next stage of the ordinance. The other thing we could do is we could just have another work session solely on the economic development, property tax exemption. Both are good options.
Yeah, I think we need a mix of both. I think we need to see what you work up and then have another workshop, but you know, during pending agenda last meeting, I thought we talked about having a work session just on the economic development portion. I thought that's what today's meeting is gonna be, so I guess I misunderstood that, so.
It's a lot of information, and I think we owe it to the community to give the attention. Clearly, we were able to dive into a lot of stuff on sales tax that needed to get more attention than I thought it needed to get, but I feel like it was given some good attention.
So is there any way to get that workup and then have another work session just on the property economic portion?
Economic development.
Yeah, the economic development portion.
Yes. That looks like the non
Yes,
Okay.
yes, please, let's go that route. Option A.
Yeah, so option A, Holly, please.
And wait, option A was the ordinance, and then get the ordinance in front of council and build a work session regarding economic development around that, right? Or was option A work session only?
No, yes to the
Ordinance.
Yes to the first one. Okay, all right. And I do apologize. I thought that our directive was bring the sales tax exemptions and be prepared to discuss them with council. So I thought that was sort of part of so I did not mean to derail your efforts.
No, that was what I had in my notes, was it was gonna be both.
I mean, we need to do both.
Yeah.
Oh, and I do want council to be aware that AML had a tax conference this last week. And during that conference, it's pretty clear that Cordova is among many Alaska communities that haven't really changed their code substantially in decades. And because of perhaps the remote sellers tax, there's a lot of curiosity. A lot of communities are looking at revising their codes or trying to update them. And so there are conversations that are being had, and that is good for Cordova since we're having this conversation right now. So I just wanted you to be aware that that's happening and that's out there, and the administration and I will keep our eyes out for anything that that might help you as you wade through this.
Any last comments?
I would like to see if anybody in the public has something to say.
Yeah, I was just I see Dottie sitting there too, so you've sat through the whole work session, would you like to come up and just comment or no? Okay, so, for your information, Holly, in the audience is a member of the community who owns a business, but is looking to, create a new business on a vacant lot. So that's why there is interest in this in the community. Okay, can we take a small break before?
Yeah, you're just gonna adjourn the work session?
Okay, well, if no objections, we'll adjourn the work session.
Okay, and we have 14 minutes till the meeting.